Full Dark, Final Chapter, Part 5. Author's Note. Written for all of you who received it, but especially for young XL who was so encouraging and enthusiastic. This is the end, the final chapter. How can I write something that I know will please everyone? I can only hope that at some point you had nothing to do and I managed to give you something to pass the time and that you thought it worthwhile. If you really liked it, it's my turn to smile. End of author's note. Full Dark, Chapter 5. Warning, unusual content. Written way past midnight. Danny rocked Benji back and forth in his arms and cried his heart out. His mom was dying of the virus and so was this kid he had come to save. Benji was perhaps 2 years younger than him, a short life. And to live through the pandemic, your body fighting off infection for so long, way longer than most other people, making it while the majority died, wondering what made you worthy and deserving of survival when better people than you perished every day, never feeling lucky but rather guilty, then finally maybe accepting your survival, feeling grateful, actually being thankful for such a remarkable body that it carried you beyond death every day for so long, right through an apocalypse, while you just tried to bring your side to your continuing survival by staying alive while in the clutches of a madman, as your boyfriend goes mad and turns into a blood-crazed monster who preyed upon those infected and sick. Just to finally realize your body has finally been overwhelmed, after all, you have finally contracted the virus. And suddenly Danny realized that Aldo had known Benji was sick, that's why he had him tied up and had shown Benji how he had cooked up some of his other victims. He was showing Benji because Benji was going into the pot too. And Aldo ate his victims to demonstrate symbolically that he was infecting himself and wouldn't fall ill. He knew the fact that he had at least first boiled them reduced chances of infecting himself, but what a hellish display, I'm going to fucking eat you. And Benji had sat there watching what Aldo promised to do. Aldo didn't just honor you by eating your power, he also demeaned you and gave you the ultimate disgraceful treatment by turning you into shit and by excreting you. And that made Danny want to let Benji see how he feeds Aldo to the many street dogs, and he would like to see Benji laugh at the transubstantiation that they would subject old Aldo to. Benji, Benji, Benji. You came so far, we've won thanks to you. And now this. He looked down into Benji's face. Benji's visage was flushed with fever, he radiated heat, he seemed to almost radiate light, his eyes gleamed, they shone, and his lips glistened, they were bright with the same most intimate color at the crown of his erection pushing hard into Danny's side as Benji had slung and wrapped his legs around him. Benji just looked at him as if he needed to and was so lucky and fortunate to have Danny to look at, to see Danny as he slipped into the void and let go. He smiled at Danny. Danny knew Benji was letting go, that this was the best way he got of doing so, that he was so very, very, very lucky to have this now after the ultimate bad luck of surviving just to perish at the end had befallen you. But Danny didn't accept this. Crying had given Danny himself a luminosity, a radiance and he too exuded power, but this was a power that reached out. His face hovered over Benji's, and he saw where the boy's body was forcing him to go. So he intervened in the only way he found possible, he bent forward, obliterating separation, coming in close to all that might kill him too, breaking the golden rule to establish a higher objective, to have his face with Benji's. Before he was that intimately colored fruit of the mouth, the softness and beyond it and it parting, entry to the beyond, his mouth opened, lips retracting and the tip of Danny's tongue appeared, but he was reaching with all of him. And their contact was electric, and there was born fusion and exchange as Danny began to very softly, so gently lick Benji's fevered lips. He traced the lines of Benji's mouth, following the pliant, yielding curvature of Benji's smile. A tingle like a single dancing crackling spark of electricity registered where Danny's tongue touched Benji's lips, he could feel Benji's life force responding, and he could taste the disease. Benji's lips were hot, but the fusion raised his body temperature even further, his blood was boiling the viral load, the virus's membranes became thinner in the heat and then at one or two places formed protrusions, cells went into overdrive to eject the pollutants in the midst since it was too hot to sustain anything else. The components of the immune system, white blood cells and antibodies suddenly recognized the newly misshapen intruders and latched onto them, but its own contents, the heat was becoming too much for the last part of the system sustaining life in these extreme conditions. Dead pathogens were expelled from the tissue and organs, rafts of dead viral material started clustering together in the bloodstream and were sourced towards transmission points from where it was to be further expelled. Benji's mouth opened, but his lips remained soft and tractable and receptive for Danny to fit his own mouth over Benji's entirely and he knew fully found what he had reached for and swallowed all of Benji he could take, seized, breathed in and yanked Benji forward and then drew him into himself, taking not only the softness of Benji, his lips, his tongue, his mouth, but pulling the very breath from its depth, and with it a gasp so deep that it sharply jolted the heart and urgently signaled to it to contract and then release, yet seize at it again and take up the pulse, and ultimately let the pulse of life itself work up a drum rhythm accompaniment to the kiss. At that moment, Danny was infected through and through. But Benji was in there too, within him, and had ignited the same heat. Two people can do this when it's just them and standing over them, watching them decide life and death. It is a tacit expression of will, not of defiance of death, but a choice to live so complete. One inferred it and the other accepted so completely, they made it a thing that they passed between them. It assumed all kinds of physical properties: heat, moisture, air, blood, an electrical spark, a charge, a physical force that reached, yanked and shoved and retracted, an impulse that roughly pushed the heart to give it no choice to but beat in recognition of love, a love more invasive than any virus. There was a warm payoff in the surrendering of the force that the body gives up only in sacrifice unless it is in ecstatic bliss, namely a surrendering of sexual energy to pay for the viral overload the system otherwise suddenly had to cope with, to insulate the souls at the highest point of fusion, to provide their bodies with its most keenest pleasure and the comfort of bliss at also the highest point in their body temperatures. To serve as an incentive to Benji's heart the moment Danny's life force roughly shoved it, because he himself would die if it didn't start to beat. That payoff was an orgasmic seminal discharge whereby the boys' bodies ejaculated involuntarily. Yes, the fucking came in their clothes. Without realizing what had happened. As far as they both were concerned, they both realized that some dread moment had passed. Something that had been there to exact payment and which would only have accepted it at the highest price had been given something else, had accepted this new compensation and had left. And had left Benji. Danny cradled and held and clutched at and hugged Benji to him, a living support system, the insistent guardian, the benevolent invader. He was utterly in love, as you might all have guessed. But it wasn't over. He couldn't keep Benji in this house reeking of death. There was an odor of corpses throughout the house. It was so warm in that room, and when the fire was dimmed a house like this becomes a fridge. So he worked quickly, tearing his own clothes off and dressed a limp swooning Benji in a second layer of clothes. He grabbed coy cloth draped over a chair and then dashed into the corridor beyond and searched a room till he came back with a duvet. And then he carried Benji unconscious down the stairs, falling when he nearly got to the bottom, and painfully broke Benji's fall by making his own body supple and just going with the fall and letting the impact reverberate through his whole body and dispersing the impact throughout him but letting Benji fall upon him. It shook Benji, and he groaned, and it was good because it jolted him away from a depth which was a new threat, a vortex which lulled him closer and which allowed what kept him alive to just grow weaker and fainter at if it beckoned the body and told it that it was exhausted and told it that it was okay to sleep and give up. Yes, you are still fucking alive. Danny screamed in Benji's face. Live, Benji. Then he laid him on the lawn, scrambled back up the stairs into Hell House and got the assault rifle, a thing so big it had to be mounted on a tripod to work best and which trailed a band of brutally big caliber bullets from a slot in its side. Danny hoped, wished, prayed that there would be enough. Then outside again, and screaming, Benji. Listen to what a racket our fucking escape is going to make. Benji. Listen here. Listen to this. And he fired the gun into the asbestos and concrete wall. There were bullets ricocheting everywhere, one could see them spark. Danny shook like a ragdoll but held that gun and pounded the wall. First, a hole appeared as big as a fist, then a whole segment of the wall began to break apart, and the top fell off, and the fence was lower by 4 feet. And still he fired, and then the wall segment just goddamn split, leaving a jagged crack, and Danny pointed to one side to one of the 2 remaining parts of that one segment of the wall and release a spider of the last 5 bullets at it, and it was enough to knock away to leave a chasm through which he slipped with Benji, half turning to go through first, then yanking Benji who could not stand much after him and again falling both, but with Danny reaching up to first catch Benji and then to embrace him and break his fall. Someone who had peeked from beyond a corner on a balcony had seen Danny tumbling through with Benji. And now elderly people were making their way towards them. And they had more blankets, and one had a drink of water, one had brandy since he knew it was so cold outside, but above all their insistent faffing and cooing over Benji brought him round and kept him from slipping away. They took him from Danny and propped Benji up and half walked half carried him towards their apartments. And Danny became aware he was nearly naked, wearing skivvies and sweater with a hoodie, but his legs were naked, his feet shoeless, it was bitterly cold. And he was bleeding quite profusely from scrapes he had sustained crossing through the wall, but also from injuries he had sustained falling on the stairs. He thought he looked so pathetic. He just stood there where the old ones had taken over, and only Alfred stayed with him. The others would make Benji comfortable and chase some medicine and sustenance into him. It was okay. He had kept him alive long enough. As Alfred handed him a hip flask of brandy, he said, "I'm sorry, mate. Your mom didn't make it." Danny the naked man-child, Danny the orphan. Danny felt so vulnerable. His sobs were like those of an animal, and he covered his face in shame. Alfred held him. Then Danny fell still, and just knew he had to be with Benji. He went inside and found him, and Benji was wrapped thickly, and Danny got onto the bed to see. He had to look into that face again and see for himself he was indeed alive. Benji was sick still, but it was his system slouching ahead under the heavy burden of diminished resources after an ordeal. And they brought Danny clothes and food. And he stayed on that bed clinging to Benji, finally falling asleep. And while he slept, the elderly watched and woke Benji for medicine, sips of water, a spoonful of brandy and a few sips of a broth. They had sauntered through the crack in the wall and had taken the food. Then Alfred set it alight and burned it with all of the dead insides. When Danny woke up, his body was fighting the infection all over again. But his immune system had fought this battle before and was armed and able to meet the invasion on different terms this time. He ran a high fever and was semi-conscious or swooning for 2 days. And when he woke and was well out of danger and healing fast, the very moment he registered what he saw, he realized he now had something. He wasn't just destitute and totally orphaned in a plague. Because Benji waited for him, standing there, and had kept vigil on the bed as Danny had with him. "You went to save him. But do you want him?" Alfred asked of Danny. It has always been Danny the bachelor, and Danny had been happy alone. Now he looked at Alfred and said, "Shit, if you save one, and he wants to stay, I sure ain't telling him to go." They were the first 2 of the new people who populated the Earth after the coronavirus had wiped most of humanity away. Those were the people who told others that in the dying moments, love saved, and the virus can be defeated with a most unlikely death-defying kiss. End of Chapter 5 and the end of Full Dark, The Corona Diaries.